Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meetup. We have Diana DeMarco Brown with us today, where she will talk about making agile work for designers. And I'm looking very much forward to this because I read your book. I was looking very much into agile UX at one point in my career. So, like, I'm quite of a fangirl, to be honest.
Oh, that's
so
sweet. Thank you.
I think this is so nice to having you here. So for those of you who do not know me, I'm Tina Øvel, and I will be your host today. And it's just great to see people signing up for these meetups, even though I know a lot of you have Zoom fatigue. So that's very awesome. So I'll say good afternoon to everybody. And I'll also say good afternoon to you, Diana. I guess I should say good morning to you.
Close enough. It's almost lunchtime.
Okay, great. So Diana is the director of product design at MOOCs and has been designing interfaces for over 2 decades. And she now spends most of the time coaching, mentoring, and designing design teams. And she's here today, and I'm looking forward, as I said before. So the agenda for today is that when I'm done with all the practicality, Diana will start her talk. You can ask questions in the QA section here in Zoom, and then we'll go through them at the end of the session. We are recording everything, and we'll share a recording as soon as possible, hopefully today or tomorrow. And we will also share Diana's slides. And then we are Preely, and for those of you who do not know Preely is a self-service platform for unmoderated remote user testing and also panel hosting. So feel free to reach out if you could see a match between your organization and our platform, and then we'll see what we can do and maybe have a demo. And I think that was all I wanted to say now. So I'll give the word and the screen to you, Diana. Take it away.
Thank you. Sorry, bear with me as I do the housekeeping of sharing screens and starting slides. All right, let's get it done. So hello. I made the mistake of deciding to put my face on a slide that I would now have to stare at, so I apologize to all of us for that. But just to give you a little context as I dive into talking about Agile, as Tina mentioned, I did write a book when I first started seeing Agile becoming really ubiquitous and being the methodology that was at play everywhere I went. I found that there wasn't a lot of guidance for designers, or what was there was very, you have to do it this way, typically by consultants. And so I wanted to learn more because it didn't seem to make sense to me that there was a one-size-fits-all approach. And in fairness, those one-size-fits-all solutions didn't fit my case. So I decided to interview about a dozen people to learn about their Agile practices and documented that in a book, mostly focusing on what did work and what didn't work, or the common factors among successful teams. And then I've just continued to listen and learn, learn about Agile and talk to people at conferences and, personally about their practices as it has evolved over the years. But before I get into some practical guidance and some tips and tricks and things to consider as you move through it, I'm going to take us to the beginning. In 2001, the Agile Manifesto was created. This is an actual screenshot of the website, which has not been updated clearly since 2001 in all its glory, with the beautiful watermark in the background. And I think it's important, to be familiar with the manifesto and the associated principles, but also to understand the context in which this was all written. This is, a documentation of what they wanted to do, but it's also very much in reaction to the waterfall practices that were the most common at that time. Things took, if you had a 1-year release cycle, you were doing really well. You were a zippy software company. So, this was kind of in reaction to those very, very slow processes that didn't have a lot of flexibility. Scrum and extreme programming existed by then, but they weren't as widely adopted until the notion of an Agile framework was really becoming popular. Kanban and Lean were also adapted to fit Agile practices. And then over the years, we've seen the rise of SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, so that enterprise companies who operate a little bit differently and a little bit slower and a little bit heavier for reasons, many of them valid, can leverage Agile practices in their environments. And I'm going to dive in on some of the principles too, because I think it's really important that while Agile methodologies tend to not speak to design directly, there's a lot of principles in there, in the main philosophy as well as in these principles, that resonate with design and can be leveraged for our work. And so I think it's just good to go back to basics and familiarize ourselves with that if you aren't already. So the first principle speaks to the highest priority being to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So this is, before we had the notion of minimal viable product that's so popular now, or has been popular and is now on the decline. This notion of smaller iterations to the customer so you could learn from them was one of the first principles of Agile. And I think that dovetails really well into every, usability designer, whatever your role is in this world, this is what you want, right? You want valuable software that's useful to the customer to get to them quicker, and then iterate on it based on their feedback. Now, we can iterate on feedback before it ships, but there's often a lot of times where things really need to be out in the real world before you can, get a real deep understanding of how customers are going to react to it and influence the next iteration. So I think this is one of the most important principles. It's their first principle, and it really sets the tone that I think dovetails nicely with typical design philosophies. The second principle also, they welcome changing requirements, even late in development, and the Agile process harnesses change for the customer's competitive advantage. So, again, you will always discover something along the way that will change maybe your initial idea. You had a feedback session with a customer, you had a conversation with a customer, you had a technical feasibility session where you realized you couldn't do some of the things you wanted to do. Requirements change either because of the customer needs or for other needs, and you need to be able to change with them. And so this really welcomes that change, and it allows that iterative within the release cycle kind of mentality that designers can take advantage of in a good way. And then there's also principle 9, which I, generously will consider a design one. And the continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. I would assume they mean architectural design in the back end, but that's fine. It's still good design. And I think being attentive to delivering a good solution does enhance agility. It allows you to not just do the least common denominator or the thing that gets out the quickest, but what is the best value we can send to the customer? What is the most reliable, most performant? All of that enhances the agility of the team, and can be leveraged, again, for the good of the customer and the good of the experience. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about the practical realities of being an Agile. Now that we've got our feet wet with the philosophy behind it, we'll start getting into the real world application. And I have to call out, most Agile practices are unique and specific, like thumbprints and snowflakes, to the company or the team that they're on. I have worked on Agile teams within the same company that functioned completely differently and had different rhythms and cadences and ceremonies and mentalities. So, recognize that your experience with one team, even within a same company, might not relate well to another team. So be flexible in your approach to this, and look at that as an opportunity to really tune what you're doing to the team that you're working with. I will also say, in my experience, there's often no training that goes on. Sometimes if a company is making a big decision to put the entire engineering org in an Agile process, they'll do a bunch of training once, often with just the engineering team. So new engineering hires that come on later may not receive the training. Designers typically don't receive the training. Sometimes PMs don't receive it. So people may be working off of a notion of Agile that may not be well informed or driven by a specific methodology or process. I make no judgment on this. I mean, theoretically, if you're going to practice something, you should be well versed in it and have some training around it. But Agile's been around long enough that I can see why people just feel like it's in the air and we can just do it. But know that often people are doing things just because they think they should and not because they've gotten some training or experience in it. So don't assume that anyone is an expert in it, because they may not be. And I mentioned this already, but the role of design is typically not spoken to, with the exception of lean UX. Design is not really mentioned significantly in most Agile methodologies. So that's a gift. That means you have the freedom to define Agile for yourself and for the design team in a way that works for your team, your design team, and the team around you in product management or engineering. Your surrounding team may look a little different. That's what my world typically looks like. And so how do we begin? We begin at the beginning again. Assess where you're at. When you're thinking about your Agile practice, whether you're getting it off the ground or trying to fine tune it because it's not quite working or you feel like it could work better, take a look at what's going on around you, right? What process are they using? Are you doing Kanban? Are you doing Scrum? What are we saying? Or is it some homegrown methodology? All of these are fine, but be aware of that. What training did people have? Are they experts in this? Do people have a lot of guidance and deep understanding of the methodology as they're making decisions about how to do the work? And if the answer is no, like, how can we get that training? Either by having some formal training, or there's so much on the internet. There's so many books. I mean, you can do some self-education. It could be a fun activity to have a book club with your compatriots and kind of talk through different methodologies and how they could apply to what you do. I mean, there's a lot of ways to train up, even if the org doesn't want to invest in that. What is the distribution of the team? Kanban works really well if everyone, in this, pre-COVID, this was true. When everyone sat in a room together and their desks were near each other and they could collaborate really easily. But Kanban doesn't work as well if you're geographically distributed or working across time zones. You might want to consider a different methodology or refine your practice to make sure it supports these things. So knowing what the distribution of the team is and what the dynamics of working together look like can influence how you implement this. So really think that through and take that into consideration. And that's not unrelated to, what are the communication challenges? Do people like to get together in a room and talk and open and freely do that? Or are they quieter and Slack conversations usually go better with that team? Do you have time zones? So asynchronous needs to be taken into consideration. So maybe documents that can be edited or contributed to or consumed at their own pace. Or do you have really healthy communication and collaboration and you don't really have to worry about that as you define your process? And what do you want and need from the other functional areas? Are you having a struggle getting clear prioritized requirements from PMs? Are you having trouble communicating your designs effectively to engineering or getting them to give you their time when they're focused on their work, or bringing you back in to review something before they submit it? What are the challenges that you're having? And what are the challenges that the other teams are having with UX? Often I find that PMs think that UX is a bit of a mystery and they don't know what's going on or when to expect work to be reviewed by them or when UX will be done with something. So is there a need for increased transparency and collaboration? Do engineers feel like they're being brought in too late in the process and they'd like to have more influence early on? What are the concerns that they have? And then translate these into requirements. Like this is where you start your journey, right? Treat this like a design problem because you are in fact designing a process. So do your research just like you would, right? You've thought about some things, you've taken some assessment of where you're at. The stakeholders at your place of employment are your customers. So interview them, talk through what they want and need and can tolerate. I have found often developer teams don't want UX work in the same backlog as they have because for having mostly to do with typically metrics and velocity, there's ways to work around that and be in the same backlog. But if you're finding a lot of resistance to that, find another way, right? And so if you don't have these conversations about what the expectations are and what the needs are, you're not going to be able to hit the mark. So this is a really important step. It also helps to get buy-in. When you do come out with a process on the other side, they will know that they were part of the influencing force to how you got to where you got. And so they'll feel bought in a little bit more. And also, again, how do they want product design fitting into their process? Do they want you at the daily stand-ups? Do they not want you at the daily stand-ups? That would be a bad thing. But sometimes if a designer straddles a couple of teams, maybe you only go to some of the daily stand-ups because otherwise you'd have too many stand-ups to go to. And then you negotiate that and set that expectation. Again, whether or not you're in the shared backlog is often an issue. But if you're not in the backlog, how are you going to create that transparency around your work so that they can see what's going on? So, just think about these things, talk them through, find out what the expectations are. And, the designers themselves will have requirements, right? I don't want to have to write user stories, or I do not want to have to size my work this way. There's a lot that goes on. Designers are very sensitive, and transitioning to Agile can often be tricky. So just make sure you're hearing them as well. And do you have additional stakeholders? Depending on what kind of company you're at and what kind of team you're working on, sales and marketing might have not a stake in terms of the sprint work, but you might get feedback from the field and they want to have a way to pass that along and get that into your backlog. Or there's roadmaps that they're interested in seeing, and they want to be aware of when a feature's being designed so that they can help you get feedback on it, or when it's shipping so that they can make sure the customers are aware of it. Similarly, customer support might have a similar interest. So they may be more downstream, but think about that. And will you have a great way to communicate with them using your methods? And educate yourself. Make sure you understand. Even if nobody else wants to read a book about Agile, you should read a book about Agile, or at least a couple articles. Like, the internet is full of information, and it's really easy to kind of form your own opinion about what you'd like to see in your process. So some other things to consider as you move through: who's going to define the work and populate the backlog? There's a lot of options. I've kind of just put 2 columns here. There is a place to bring product management into things, especially to have them write the epics is a great way to document the conversations between the two of you and have a shared understanding. And, often it can serve as a lightweight contract. Like, this is what PM said they wanted, so this is what I'm executing on. And then you can create stories, depending on what you're, whether you're using Jira or another system, you can create stories that relate back to that epic that are in more detail, and UX can write those themselves. That often tends to be easier. And it's a great way to move forward with the work. There's also some ways that you can maybe take roadmap items that convert over to the epics, right, easily. There's, say you're using product board and there's an integration with Jira or something like that. So you can make this not a heavy burden for the PMs, but getting their involvement and getting them to really engage with you in a way that documents what they want is important. Now, maybe they write a requirements document and you can just copy and paste from there. That's one way, but having them really actively engage in creating the epics and prioritizing them with you, that gets them really more involved with what you're doing. And that's ideal. The more involved they can be, the more collaborative it feels like, the better off you are. Again, UX should probably write their own user stories for a lot of different reasons, but it's really important that you review them with the other functional areas. That planning and grooming is an action that you do, whether you're doing it as part of the engineering team or as you're doing it as a separate UX effort, making sure that when you plan and when you groom, you have at least a representative from engineering in the room and PM, whoever your main stakeholders are, to help you prioritize, to make sure they understand what you're taking on and what the scope of it's going to be, and to have those discussions as you plan and groom. Those are really critical. Those conversations can be more organic if UX is sharing their backlog with their engineering team, because then the engineers don't have to have this separate meeting. It's just part of their own backlog, grooming, and planning. Although some teams don't do that. So if they don't, maybe you want to have your own, that's fine. But making sure that it's as easy as possible to view the UX work. When it's a shared backlog, when it's a shared sprint, it's just more organic for the engineers to know what designers are doing without putting effort into finding it out. Because the more friction you create around finding out what the team is doing, the less likely people are to do it. So the more that you can be incorporated into the existing processes around you, the better insight people will have into the work that you're doing and can support you. Grooming and planning is my favorite thing. I think teams that put effort into these activities tend to be more successful with their outcomes and hitting dates and delivering the right things at the right time. Many teams treat this as a single event. I will be candid, some teams skip this altogether. I do not recommend that. A single event, I think, is fine if you're really efficient. Sometimes the grooming can happen well ahead, or you do it at the beginning of the quarter, at a certain point in time, and then you can just plan every sprint from there. Whatever works for your organization is fine. 2 separate meetings also works. You can have a grooming session, with just one engineering manager and a PM, or a couple designers, or, just a smaller group, and then do the planning for the sprint, with a bigger group. Whatever makes sense is fine. but these meetings set the expectations around what work you're doing. They create a shared understanding of the scope of and the activities that are critical to success. So you're getting clarity around, I am going to work on this. It's going to be a research effort, or this is a research spike. We don't know what we're going to get out of it, but this is what we're doing. Or, hey, I'm going to start roughing out this workflow, but I'm going to need feedback from you and you during that. It just is a really great way to communicate what's happening. And it gives your stakeholders an opportunity to say, hey, it's a little too soon for you to start working on it. We're not ready to have that conversation yet because we have an engineering spike we need to do first. Or, yeah, I thought that was a priority, but now that we've been talking to people and we've been working on this other stuff, that's less of a priority. So we should do this other thing first. And it really just makes sure that everybody's on the same page and that design's not working in a vacuum. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to prioritize the work. I love a stacked rank backlog in the order of priority, and then reprioritizing at the beginning of every sprint. Reprioritizing over time is very critical because things will change. Engineering work will take longer or less time than anticipated. And so, you may have to adjust the scope of the release or the sprint. And as a result, things may shift in priority. This becomes more important because we couldn't do this, or this came late, so now we really have to do this. That revisiting the priorities is really healthy and really important. And can't emphasize the value of that enough. Often what comes up is a question about whether or not people should even have sprints, right? Because, certainly if your engineering team is chugging along in sprints, design can choose to participate in that or not. I recommend that you do, just because it makes your cadence a little more similar to the engineering org. There's a start and a complete time to a chunk of work that's clear and expected, and everybody's in that rhythm. But, you have to decide this for yourself. I find that the more complexity there is, the more important it is to have this structured framework around your work. People will know what to expect and when to expect it. There's a lot of variation in the length of sprints. Personally, I have found 3 weeks tends to be a sweet spot. There are teams that definitely do 2 weeks. I find, especially for designers, that tends to be a very short amount of time. It can be done. You can do 2 weeks. It's not a big deal. It just tends to be a little harder sometimes, especially if you're designing for more complex work. It makes it often a little harder to chunk the work to fit into that 2 weeks sprint, but it can be done. 3 weeks tends to be good. 4 weeks is a little on the long side, but obviously you've got to work with whatever you've got, and staying in a cadence that is related to engineering's cadence is really important. You don't want to have them start their sprint. They start their sprints on Tuesday of the second week of the month or whatever it is. And, you've got a different length sprint that starts at a different time. That's going to make things really confusing. Try to be in sync and have a similar cadence in a way that doesn't overlap with meetings. And I'll have an example of how I've structured this at other companies at the end. Some things to think about as you're defining the work and you're looking at how to fit your work into sprints. As I've mentioned, you can be in the backlog with the team, the engineering team, or not. You can also be in the same sprint or not. You can have a sprint that runs at the same time but isn't theirs. And, oh yeah. Oh, sorry, I just looked at the question and I just scooched ahead. We'll get back to that question because it's an excellent one. Working within a dev sprint is the best idea if there's a single designer on that team and that's the only team that they support. So then it's easier to be in sync with them and you're just a member of that team doing work, whether it's in the same backlog or not. But when you have your stand-ups, you can say what you're working on and people can see that. Having a separate UX sprint, which is also known as parallel sprints, was very popular when Agile first came out. It does allow for a dedicated UX backlog that can even span multiple products and doesn't interfere with engineering metrics. It just decreases some of the transparency into the work you're doing and creates a little more overhead, but it's a viable approach, certainly, and it has been a very popular one in a lot of places. Sprint length. Even if you choose to do independent sprints, the cadence has to match, which I mentioned before. And sometimes you may find if they start on a Tuesday, you start on the Thursday, just so that the planning, grooming, and stand-up and kickoff events don't collide, but more or less be the same cadence. Just to speak to the question, that's in the chat. When you're doing planning and grooming, you can do some, I find the grooming should be done on the work that's being taken in the sprint. So, that's why I say you can separate these meetings. If you're in the session with engineering and it feels like there's no time for the grooming and planning of the design work, you can have a separate, and I have done this many times, you can have a separate session that's just focused on the design work. Maybe it's a half an hour, it's not even a full meeting, right? You can have a smaller grooming and planning session for just the design work with a smaller subset of folks. I would say grooming can be done separately. Planning, I might try to keep in the team as much as possible, simply because planning is a little bit less. It's just saying, okay, these are the tickets I'm going to work on, and doing that in the same room with the entire engineering team that's working, the entire Scrum team, creates awareness of what you're working on, which you really do want. But the grooming, which is the deeper dive and what's the priority and what does this mean and what does this task look like, that can be a smaller subset. Maybe only the people working on the tasks that you're grooming can be in the room. You can have it separate. There's different ways to work this. I don't know if that answers your question or not. We can go back to it at the end of the session, but there's a lot of ways to work that. At a minimum, you can have a separate grooming meeting if that makes sense, but try to keep the planning as in the room as possible if you can. And if you've done good grooming ahead of time, it makes it quick. It only takes like 2 minutes to be like, these are the tasks I'm doing in this sprint. And so you can move forward that way effectively. Because really one of the things that I find so useful about Agile in general, and especially it gives you the opportunity to really be part of the Scrum team if you're working on Scrum, but that product development team, you can be an equal member with equal footing and create a lot of awareness about what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you get there, who you're going to need time from when. It creates that opportunity in these events, assuming you do have these activities like grooming and planning and stand-ups, that otherwise would have to be overhead that the designer would have to do. And it would be hard to get the whole team involved. There's a lot of really organic benefits and transparency you can create around your work this way, which I really love. It's one of the reasons I love Agile as much as I do. Research and design deliverables. Questions often come up around these. I know originally there was a lot of like, oh gosh, how are we going to do research? Because, you just have these 2 or 3 week sprints and you have to do all this work. You can fit it. I mean, you can fit it in. It's easy. You just have to be creative about it sometimes. You can treat research as a spike, just like engineering research, right? You can say, we don't know, but we're going to investigate this and it's going to be a spike and we don't know what's going to come out of it, right? And so that's an option. One thing that I have done is, okay, we have a certain amount of discovery to work to do. You guys are doing your high level architecture, but we have some additional discovery to do. This sprint, I'm just talking to customers. And so I'm going to have my customer calls. And at the end of the sprint, my demo to you will be delivering the research, right? And so you can have a dedicated sprint to that. Same for usability testing. You can say at this point, probably around sprint 4, we're going to be ready for usability testing. We're going to spend that chunk of time just doing user feedback sessions and fit it in that way. These are just a couple of options. There's many different ways to fit this in. You can have recurring monthly usability sessions. And so when you have a sprint, or weekly or whatever. And so when you get to, so every sprint or every other sprint, that you're going to be doing some research work. There's just so many choices and options here. But it can be done. It's easy to do, to leverage the framework to describe that work, and also reduces the mystery around that work when people can see that, it takes 2 weeks to have all those conversations and what comes out of it, and that you have to do this analysis. They actually can understand your work a lot better, which is a great thing. You may also find in terms of deliverables, because if you are really in a place where you're part of the team that's working and you're part of daily stand-ups and you're part of the planning and grooming and everyone knows what you're working on, you may actually be able to stay low fidelity longer because there's this constant collaboration and discussion, and they know what you're working on, and they know what your design intentions are, and they know where you're headed. And you can actually wait longer to do high fidelity Figma files. I say that with a grain of salt because I know everybody jumps right into their Figma files from the beginning, and it's hard to do low fidelity work, but you might be able to at least stay in wireframey black and white Figma files for longer. Agile really does support closer collaboration when it's at its best. So you may find that you have fewer deliverables or less documentation to produce because the team's been part of it all along. So you've designed this beautiful process, you've put a lot of thought into it, you've socialized it. So you got to document it, you got to communicate about it, and then you got to revisit it, right? You got to make a picture, even if it's a silly picture. I've made any number of silly pictures to describe how my team is going to work, and used those to get the buy-in from stakeholders and get feedback about what we're about to do and get sign off on that. And then you publish it, right? You put it on your Notion page, you put it on your wiki page, you put it on Confluence page, like whatever you have, put it out there. And that way people can remember what you're doing. If they forget later, you can remind people if they're not adhering to the process that this is what we agreed to and this is what I need to do. But also you need to revisit the process. Retrospectives are also one of my favorite events in an Agile process. And they're a real opportunity to understand what's working well and what's not working, and to change it. And that can mean small tweaks in just the way you interact with each other, or a big revision of the overall process. An Agile process, the first one you come up with may not work, and that's okay. You know, the whole point of Agile is to be flexible and iterative and revisit it. And that includes the way you do Agile itself. So adjust as needed and don't feel like it's a failure. If you uncover what's not working for people and you try to fix it, that is a win, and it's a huge win. So I'm absolutely supportive of that. This I'm showing to you in no way representing anything ideal. This is just one of those silly pictures that I put together for a team to describe how we were going to fit into their process at the organization that I was at the time. The development team had just begun working in an Agile methodology. We were not geographically co-located. We had development teams in Ireland, Sweden, and Russia and the United States. We had designers in most of those locations as well. And so there was a lot of complexity to that, time zones, all sorts of daylight savings time. And one of the decisions that was made by the development organization, they wanted 2-week sprints. The design team, most of whom had not practiced Agile before, was not ready for that. And so 2 weeks, going from never having to scope their work to scoping it in 2-week chunks was just a really big lift for the team. And so we didn't. We decided that what we would do is we would have a UX sprint that would be the equivalent of 2 development sprints. So we would have 4-week-long sprints. It was not my ideal rhythm and cadence, but what I didn't want was like a 2-week sprint for dev and a 3-week sprint for us, so that we were always off cycle. This way, just doubling what they were doing, we would start at the same time and end at the same time as the second one. So we could prioritize work in the beginning of our UX sprint if we thought it was going to influence their dev sprint. And so we kind of this was how we were going to begin. It wasn't the end goal and it wasn't how we stayed, but it was how we started, as development figured out what worked for them and we figured out what worked for us. We had separate backlogs because that was the preference of that development organization. But each backlog was product team specific. So, there were parallel backlogs, if you will. And we were really clear, like, we're going to kick a sprint off, but before we do it, we're going to have the PMs and the UX team. The engineers were welcome, but they weren't actually that interested in being involved in those activities. And for that organization, it was fine. That communication wasn't required. So they were welcome and invited, but they were always optional because we didn't want to put a burden on them. And because of the time zone issues, we had basically, a small window of overlap, and that's when everyone put their meetings in. So we were being sensitive to working a little more asynchronously. So but the PMs really did need to weigh in heavily. And so we made sure that we would do that. We indicated where we would kick off our sprint, and then we indicated when we would start grooming for the next sprint. So right after development wrapped up their sprint, a little bit after that, we would start grooming for the next design sprint. And that way, you know, anything that had gone on in the dev sprint could influence what we did or didn't prioritize based on what they got to or didn't get to. And then we also documented, like, we're going to review the sprint. Retros were not common at that organization, and the engineering team, when they did their retros, they didn't do them very often, and it only included engineering, which was interesting because many of the communication problems were not within engineering, but between the groups. So we wanted to be clear that we were going to do retros every time. We called them sprint reviews, and that they would include the PMs and the architects. The entire product team was welcome. And if there were specific issues that had come up, we might invite specific people, but they would not be required, again, because of the sensitivity of meetings. So, and then we would take that review, the formal review of the designs, and then we would do the retrospective. So sorry, I'm conflating two things here. The sprint review was the formal review of the design work. So it was like our demo. And this retrospective was something that we did with the UX team, the PM, and the architects with the optional addition of the engineering team. So we had 2 end of sprint activities, and reviewing the designs was fairly important for us to have that socialization. We did it asynchronously as well, but we wanted to be clear that, like, this is the design we came up with. This is our deliverable for the sprint. Let's talk about it, because typically development would be implementing it in a future sprint. So we wanted to make sure that conversation happened. So again, a silly chart, took not that much time to make, but was incredibly powerful to communicate and get feedback on. So this, you know, did iterate as we were working through some things. And so this served as a great mechanism to communicate with everybody. So the power of a silly PowerPoint slide cannot be underestimated. And that's all I have on my prepared comments list. But I love hearing what everyone has to say. So I'm happy for more questions, or if it would be useful to follow up on my garbled answer to the grooming and planning questions, or just to hear some of the challenges you guys have faced. Because again, this is part of me learning what's going on with you guys today for Agile. So
thank you so much, Diana. We'll see if we have some questions in the Q&A session. I have a question. So
sure.
When you're talking about this process and you being a UX designer in an organization, it seems like you're working within one team, but what happens if you need to be spread out? What we see very often in organization is that you are very thin spread out as a UX designer and maybe working on 2 or multiple projects at a time. Like, have you experience with working with this satellite approach, or how do you actually do that?
I have done it. It's not my preference because I find it's hard to balance. Although I think it's better to be on 2 Agile projects than sometimes at companies, some teams practice Agile and some do not. Straddling an Agile and a non-Agile is actually the worst thing because you'll always be urgent on the Agile side and never on the other side. So things will get out of balance really quickly. Overall, everything I've said in here, I think still holds regardless if you're doing 1 or 2, but you might make more trade-offs. So what often happens is, okay, guys, you guys have your grooming and planning sessions at the same time because everybody's at the same cadence, right? I can't come to both, or I can come to one, maybe front load the UX issues at the front, right? Or anything that engineering is working on that I need to know about so that I can come the first whatever amount of time to your meeting and then go to the other team's meeting. Also, I can't be at all the stand-ups, right? Because if you're at stand-ups for 2 teams, that's half your workday, right? Like, I mean, not really, because they're only supposed to be 15 minutes, but it's still a lot. So you negotiate, you say, look, I can only be, like, let's talk about it. What works for you guys? And this is what works for me. And then you negotiate. And, I've seen situations where design doesn't go to any, or they go to once a week, or they go Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? And so the team knows if there's UX specific things, or, to expect to see that information from the UX team in those daily stand-ups where they attend. So it's a negotiation and a conversation. And I actually think it's really helpful because when we weren't in Agile and you were straddling two different projects or two different teams, you just didn't have those conversations. But that just meant a lot of expectations were going unexpressed. You know what I mean? And so this gives you a framework to say, okay, these are all the events you have. How do you want me to show up? This is what I think I can do. What do you guys need? And have that back and forth so that they're not like, why is she not at stand-ups? Because you've had that conversation, you know? So I find it's good to just talk it through. Say, this is what I can support, Simon. You know, this is what I can't. What would be useful for you? And just be explicit. I find the more conversation you have, the better off. And then, you know, do what's best for you. It is hard. My preference is to not have people straddle multiple Agile teams, but sometimes you can't, you know, sometimes you don't get to pick, you don't get to pick. So
exactly. What are your experience in, like, very often when I work in big organization, they have like a specific UX team for the beginning. So for like finding out what concept you need to work with and so on. And at some point we'll have some sort of delivery when we go into Agile. But have you ever seen this like more research part being carried out in an Agile way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've done discovery work within an Agile team, like, you know, and done what I said, like, okay, you guys are still hashing out some of the technical stuff. Like, we know we're doing this, but I need to talk to people more to get some details about, you know, how they're going to do it or what it's going to look like. So while you guys are doing your high level software design, I'm going to have this sprint dedicated to research. So you can do, you know, discovery research within the Agile framework. Sometimes there's a sprint zero concept that people use, like that's kind of their planning one. That's a great place for discovery work. You may have to do discovery work. Sometimes you'll get to the sprint design work for that release, whether you're releasing every sprint or not. You know, can wrap up and maybe design as a head of engineering. So maybe you can do that as a discovery for the next set of, you know, deliverables. You can carve it out and just highlight that. I mean, I think it can be done. If you haven't done any discovery and it's a real blank page, then it's a little trickier. But if you have a sense of what you're doing and it's reasonable and you're just validating or getting certain details, you know, you can say this sprint, we're going to do research, and maybe it's 2 sprints, you know, like maybe it's a bigger chunk of time, but you can do that. And also, I think that creates a lot more visibility into the work of research, which is almost always invisible to people, right? Like if you're coming into stand-ups and you're like, I talked to 3 people today, 2 people tomorrow, they almost never get that kind of update on your research, right? So it's actually nice to bring the team into it that way.
Yeah, that sounds great. What are your experiences with having a UX product owner? Have you ever had, like, tried to have that, or have you had that role?
I have not. I have been at organizations that did it. Like after I left, I know that there was one org where a UX person was the product owner. I have not. I don't know. There's a lot of, product owners, there's like a tricky role, right? Like I've been in a lot of places where the PM is the product owner. I've been in places where there's a PM and then a separate product owner, right? Because the PM owns a bunch of products. And so there's a product owner for each Scrum, you know, Agile team. I don't know. I go back and forth on that. I think I don't know. I'm a little agnostic. I think whatever works, works. I don't have a lot of preconceived notions. It's hard to be doing work in the sprint and being the owner, though. That's all I will say. Like if you're executing, that's why sometimes it makes sense for it to be a PM, because they're kind of the owner anyway, and they're not executing. They don't have any deliverables in the sprint. So sometimes that's why that makes sense. But it's hard to be a designer and an owner because you're a fox and a chicken, right? Like, or I guess in the language, you're a pig and a chicken in the sprint language. But so sprint goals with both dev and UX in one sprint. Do you have that? I love the idea of a common sprint goal. Sorry, I had a friend who used to call them sprinkles, because if you say it really fast, it sounds like that. So I can't not say sprinkles when I say sprint goals. But I think it depends on if there's alignment, right? Often, if everyone happens to be doing the same work at the same time, that there's a common sprinkle, that's awesome. That might mean, though, that UX is really squeezed because they have to deliver on it at the beginning of the sprint in order for engineering to finish it at the end of the sprint or something like that. But if there can be a common one, I think it's wonderful. But I don't think there's any shame in having separate ones either. Again, it depends on the work and it make, you know, your team and whatever makes sense. So again, I'm not religious about that, but it's awesome if there is one goal, because the more you can make it feel like you guys aren't separate and you're one team, the better off you are. So I love the idea of having a unified sprint goal. If you can't have close collaboration, yeah. So what are some other ways? I think one of the ways that you can do, it depends on what your collaboration challenges are, right? A lot of times the reason you don't have close collaboration is because of time zones and geographies and remoteness and all that. So then, you know, Slack channels and dedicated discussion channels can be really useful. I like tools like Whimsical and Miro and gosh, what are we using it now? We're using even another tool where you can do, post-it exercises, and you can even do them asynchronously, and you can have, this virtual whiteboard that lives, and, people can contribute and collaborate either in a session that you're doing together or asynchronously where you just have it up there and they can interact and collaborate, vote on this, go, here's the post-its, arrange them, or what do you think the issues are, right? Like there's so many activities you can do collaboratively. And I also, back in the day, we used to call it putting your stuff on the wall, right? When we were all in offices together. So now you can use the digital world, right? Have some Notion pages and have a place to go, like what we're doing this week, and put it up there. Have a Slack newsletter that goes out to the team, like, hey, this is what we did with image. If you have images, you'll get people to look at them because everybody loves to look at a design. Design reviews do focus on the end. So I do like, if you're only communicating then that's late, right? So I do like more like weigh in, like what are the priorities? Here's a sketch. What's your, what do you think? And, get reactions to people so that, share a balsamic sketch, or, sketch on a whiteboard or sketch in one of the virtual whiteboards and get feedback that way. So you can get a lot of collaboration that way and kind of figure out what's going to work for your team. But the more you can do along those lines, I agree, the better off you are.
Yeah. So you talked about having UX work in the same backlog, and there was some resistance. Do you have any ideas on how to actually make it work then?
Yeah, so I did, and but this particular development manager was very rigid on it, and I was like, it doesn't matter, right? So because and I did explain to him, his concern, just to be candid, was he didn't want it influencing the velocity metrics because they were very concerned about their velocity metrics. One of the ways around it is you always assign 0 to the UX work, so then it doesn't impact your velocity at all, right? That wasn't comfortable enough for him. It didn't feel like it still wasn't right, but that's okay. He didn't want it, so we didn't have to do it. You know what I mean? We had a UX backlog for that team, that was separate, and we still could review it in those planning sessions and their daily stand-ups. It just was a separate backlog. So it was a little bit of friction, but less friction than them resenting us being in the backlog. So, and this was early in their adoption. It's like, this was not a hill I was going to die on, so to speak. Like it didn't matter. We could get around it. And who knows, in a future sprint, he could change his mind. Like once he saw how we were working, or that it wouldn't matter, or that they weren't really paying attention to velocity anyway in his team, it could change over time. So I'm very much the like, let's try it and see what works, and then we'll figure it out. And so, it's, I'm all about meeting them where they're at. It doesn't have to be that, like, it doesn't have to be dogmatic. So yes, we did discuss, because I've done it in other places, and it's like, look, we just assign 0, because I don't, and this might be a dirty little secret, but I actually I don't size UX work ever in a backlog, because I never measure velocity, in part because velocity is a controversial thing. And there's a lot of teams in engineering who've moved away from velocity for legitimate and valid reasons. Velocity only makes sense when you're looking at it in aggregate across a team. Typically, you only have one designer or a part of a designer assigned to a team. So looking at the velocity of one person is not a useful metric typically. And so I don't waste time with it, because I'm also not measuring the velocity of my team. UX shrinks or expands to fit depending on the time that we're given. We're almost never in control of the dates. So my velocity is not a meaningful metric, and so I don't measure it. So I don't size work. Like we might t-shirt size it, small, medium, large, and that's fine. And that is a valid and useful technique, but I don't story point it. So we give it a story point of 0. It doesn't affect your metrics, but if you want clean data and you're worried about just our presence in the backlog messing things up, fine. We don't have to be, not a big deal. So,
yeah. So do you have any best practices? If you are a new UX designer, you come in, you start working Agile, where to start, what to do?
I mean, where to start? again, like it's, it's all those things like what's going to work for the team around you, because again, I've done it differently almost every place I've been at, because it really, the whole point of Agile is that it works for your team. And if something's not working for you, then it's not working for the team. Or if something's not working for your team members, it's not working for the team. So I would scope it too, but my gold standard is be in the backlog, be in the sprint, be part of their team process as much as you can. And if you can't be, figure out what the next best alternative is. But educate yourself, interview your constituents, understand their needs and wants, and go from there.
Yeah. And what about the different artifacts or the different ceremonies you have in Agile? Do you have any experiences in some of them being better at leveraging UX than others? You talked a bit about retrospective, of course, and also being present in the daily stand-ups and so on. But do you have anything more in that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have found some teams don't do retrospectives, right? And that's a flag to me. If people don't, and demos can be tricky too. I like as a designer to make sure that I'm doing an end of sprint demo, because often designs change or evolve, and it's really important to say this is what we're doing. So if your team isn't doing routine demos, that doesn't mean you can't, right? And no one needs to recognize that like you're doing them at the end of the sprint, and that it's essentially a ceremony that it's informal, you just decided it. You can still do those retrospectives. If your team isn't doing retrospectives, that's a good reason for you to have a separate backlog and a separate sprint. So you can say, well, we do retrospectives for mine, right? Retrospectives are incredibly critical. Of course, everybody has to openly participate in them and be open to that process. But I think making sure that retros are happening and that planning and grooming is happening, those things are so critical to the success. If you need to call them something different, or you need to disguise it to make the medicine go down, whatever, it's fine. But making sure that those things happen and that you're a part of those things is super important.
Yeah. It sounds. I think it's so interesting. So again, I think we have like time for an extra question, and if that doesn't come in, then I have a question about I'm not sure how much you work with the usability and UX maturity and so on. But do you have any experiences in how you can actually use Agile UX to maybe heighten the UX maturity in an organization?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting. I guess it depends on notionally what maturity model you're using, but I would say, I think you can, because I think making sure that you're having those conversations around prioritization and planning and grooming with your PMs also gives you the opportunity to influence that, right? So making sure that it gives you the greater voice in the process, and having that transparency and visibility into your work tends to help the maturity of the process, because it's not a mystery. People understand it and therefore typically know how to better leverage it. So you're really doing a lot of education as part of these exercises. So I do think it can influence the maturity and help you guys focus on the more strategic things. And you can actually leverage it to make sure you're working on the highest value items and not just putting in a checkbox, right? Like that you're working on the interactions and the workflows, and that your work is tied to business outcomes, and that you're influencing the business and, certainly the customer experience. But you can make sure that your work is elevated and not just the drudgery too, that you're not just a UI person moving pixels. So I do think that you can leverage these things to make sure that you're working on the most strategic thing, and make sure that they're understanding that that's your interest, is to work on the most strategic thing. So I do think you can leverage them, those things to increase the maturity. Do I have tips for building UX stories in a backlog? Yeah. So interesting. Yeah. So I like the notion of having epics, because the granularity of the design work can vary wildly, right? Like you might be working on an entire screen, or you might be working on a small interaction. And if they all bubble up to an epic, sometimes that gives you a little more control over that. And also it can send that signal of having that overview of what's coming next. Like I'm working on this ticket, but it relates to this epic. And so people can be thinking of that. I don't know if that answers your question. It is tricky. Getting the granularity for UX stories is something that takes a minute, because typically designers don't like to have to break their work down into small chunks. So that can often be an education and a learning. but yeah, that way, and if your epic relates to a roadmap item, right? And so then you're making that connection. I think you can maybe give that overview a little bit with your UX stories. Yeah. Or maybe populate it more deeply so that you have things that are, I don't know if you're concerned about long-term stories or just letting people know what's coming in the next sprint, but I think you can have more things in there so people can be aware of what's coming. And maybe that's a place where you spend more time in grooming and planning. Not sure what the issue is that you're trying to solve with the backlog, but.
I actually have a question in relation to this, because have you ever worked with UX stories like in the backlog and actually having acceptance criteria for them, like for instance, testing wise?
Yep. Yeah. When we implemented the example I showed you, we had acceptance criteria for everything. So we actually had a template. We used Jira there. And so we had a Jira template. So when you were doing stories, you had this template and there was a section for acceptance criteria in it. So, you could reuse it. That was more critical for engineering, right? Because they had the set of acceptance criteria, and there were things in engineering acceptance criteria that related to UX, like if it's got front end features, check with the designer before you submit it, right? And they also had quality things. And so there were acceptance criteria that were standard as part of their stories. Now, I will say the downside to it being a template is that over time, people start to kind of gloss over it and ignore it because it's the same every time, but whatever. We also had similar acceptance criteria in the UX stories that, get a review from the PM, get a review from the engine, the front end engineer who will be implementing this, because they were typically implementing it in a future release, right? So, we did have acceptance criteria around that because that was a problem we needed to solve at that org. You could have any acceptance criteria in it that made sense for you, and make sure that you're part of the engineering acceptance criteria.
So. Yeah, as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I think this is so interesting and so inspiring. But I can see time is almost up, so I think we need to round up now, unfortunately. But
so fast.
I think it has been very, very interesting and also very inspiring to hear you talk. And it's just so nice to hear that you are facing a lot of the same issues that we are facing right now, right? So it's just it seems to be common in general that UX designers, we are struggling with the same things across the world, not just here in Denmark or in Europe, right?
Oh no.
So
it is a universal struggle. I don't know if that's a comfort or not, but
it's just so I think I will say thank you so much for now, Diana, and then I'll also say thank you so much for you behind the screen. We are recording the talk, and you'll receive a recording maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. I'm not completely sure, and also Diana's slides.
Yeah.
And again,
anyone is welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, or if you have any other questions, or for those of you who are watching this at breakfast in the future, you were welcome to reach out to me over LinkedIn if you have any other questions.
That sounds great. And again, you're also more than welcome to reach out to us here in Preely if you have ideas on how you might utilize Preely in your own organization, if you want to create your own user panel in your organization. If you're just curious to hear what we can do, reach out, and then we can arrange a talk or a demo. And also, if you have ideas on topics or speakers you would like to hear here, let us know, and then we'll see what we can do. So I think that was all for now. So thank you for now. Thank you for joining, and have a great evening, and have a great day, Diana.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Talk to you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.